Welcome to a presentation on the idea of what is resource and what is this which is the source of being. From the standpoint of three important figures in philosophy, and those are the following: Descartes, René Descartes, Georg Hegel, and a French philosopher called Paul Ricoeur. And the reason I am examining this presently and undulating between Descartes and Hegel is Paul Ricoeur has sort of insisted that the human body, our physical being, as it were, is influenced by what we posit in our minds in the form of a cogito. Now, the book I'm speaking of is this book published by Northwestern University Press, Paul Ricoeur's Freedom in Nature, Voluntary and Involuntary. And in reading the book, I've come to realize several things about the possible relationship between Hegel and Descartes. And these will be demonstrated in the following analysis, which is perhaps something that is intentional toward different things than would otherwise be considered notions that someone would approach the object of thought as something that was anything other than what it actually was to the subject. The object of thought is being posited. We say we exist, we know ourselves to exist, and we identify with the outer forces of reality and the inner forces of reality within our minds that are not purely just fictions of the notion that we exist here on planet Earth and there's something to be considered whereto we, even as singular autonomous beings, we would somehow at some point be able to access a datum that was something other than what we would actually approach in our daily lives. And that, for instance, to include Husserl into this, as Paul Ricoeur is very much engaged with Husserl under certain conditions, that what Husserl calls the dater consciousness in the book Ideas. Now, what this attempts to accomplish, and I believe really does achieve, is this idea that what we have here is something of a template for the way the inner and the outer are laid out topographically, in terms of regional expectations, and in terms of aspirations to be what I've pronounced to be the notion that is not intended to be something considered despotic, but is the notion that one asserts a principle that I am world. Now, what I am world means is principled upon the notion that presenting the world with the I suggests that because there is a presence on earth that is subject to its own formal identification, its self-identification, that when it posits itself, it is not only a physical being, perhaps to some a specimen, and to others merely a corporeal body that embodies something that is perhaps other than itself. And to describe this in terms of that being something that is determined by the world itself, that the world itself determines what is objective to us, the way we identify ourselves as corporeal beings. The notion that one would be so sort of principled to suggest that I am world, I posit myself, and for I identify in the world as a being that is fixated upon the notion of identity as something that is more than just contained within the corporeal body, but something that is represented to others, that may not necessarily be identifying with themselves in the same way as one might be, but would be introduced to that otherness in a certain way. Now, to follow through with what I had already suggested were the three formal points of historical philosophy that suggested Hegel, Descartes and Hegel, and Paul Ricoeur would be instruments of this notion, and perhaps Husserl as well. As I've always been very interested in the idea that Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit was a book that really came back into popularity in the 20th century and was being read in the English-speaking world again, and they were adopting a lot of these ideas, but that the credit for phenomenology were attributed to Husserl. And for this reason, I've always been sort of centered on the principle of combining those two in some way. I know it's an entirely different approach to philosophy between Husserl and Hegel, but what we can see from this is when we consider Husserl's as adopting the aesthetics, perhaps, that Hegel had suppressed. Hegel had suppressed a lot of his aesthetic knowledge, and perhaps that is the phenomenology of Husserl had more of a presence of aesthetic content, whereas Hegel falls into the category where I will really try to make haste in terms of describing and determining the idea of what I call the positing of what is called a coextensive magnitude in Hegel's book, The Science of Logic. To posit a coextensive magnitude, one must already suggest that the sort of Cartesian notion that one exists, one is said to exist and posits their ego, is to be greeted with the presence of the other that is already within the magnitude itself. It's already within the object of thought. So there is a synthesis that has occurred that has presented one with an object that is part of the existential reality of what subjects are presented with. Now, the important point to consider is whether or not this coextensive magnitude is faced with the same things that the Cartesian identity are faced with. And that is the idea that this process of recognizing the self as I am world, I am positing myself as an identical being in the world, and recognizing how I project myself onto others, would be a process where at varying differential points in space and time, we would know that Descartes had already suggested that the ego cogito, the Cartesian cogito, was impervious to the others, that it would not be sort of introduced to a synthesis process of synthetic a priori adjudication of the presence of another within consciousness. So where too we acknowledge the fact that the cogito is something very sort of essentially autonomous ultimately, but it comes back to the notion that this presence of I am world, I am the cogito that posits my selfhood, but that we of course know that there is no synthesis between Descartes and Hegel. But we can certainly say that the body itself will reproduce phenomena, the phenomena of Kant, for instance, that are finding themselves compartmentalized into varying identities at some point that are all transfixed with their own process of self-realization and self-identification in the Marxist sense. So they're going through their own process with identifying as an object of thought what is outside the inner space and what is inside the outer space of consciousness. Now, in the science of logic, the notion that the coextensive magnitude would be an a priori consideration of this which had been fused already, combined, there would be no abstraction from that. And for this reason, I suggest that the logic of state philosophy in this particular instance is falling short of the idea that one is self-representing. One represents the self in a very sort of actual fashion. But where I would say that the science of logic sort of gains favor is in the idea of the extensive magnitudes that very much resembles the res extensa of Cartesian thought. And how this falls into recur has a lot to do with the body and how the body identifies phenomena that are both present within the body at a certain point in time, biochemically, biogenetically, ontogenetically, and then removed, in a sense, from the body. And then how there would be something reflexive between the way someone were to identify themselves as within the biospheres of activity that determined I would see myself as present within a world, as without actually pursuing some sort of formal organization of political activity that would say that because this is within my being, I must respond to it in an adequate fashion, would suggest that was something very despotic or sort of a form of insurgency that it comes unrecommended and is not within the confines of the sort of very rational pursuit of doing philosophy, which is to consider these ideas as not as cathartic measures of the potency of the politicization of the id, but rather to consider them as dialectical components of what would drive the categories out from their static points in time, where they are being sort of simply viewed by individuals. These are the categories that we perceive, and we are finding ourselves within these categories, and those are what they are, these are what they are. And that is the only way to self-identify, is to categorize the self such that self-identity would be within those forms of thought. And then the content would be the addition to it. Now, Paul Ricoeur's idea, which is interestingly sort of hedged upon what I had earlier said about the coextensive magnitude, would be that in the book Freedom and Nature, Voluntary and Involuntary, that there would be a response, a form of stimuli that would create a phenomenon in the subject that would make them have a reflexive activity that they had not determined. So I'm trying to abandon that idea and create something essentially that is reflexive of self-identification in this principled notion of I am world, a very open state of being that is identifying with the corporeal body, embodying only the things that are particular to it, but also within universal ideas that are based upon the articulation of the self as something that is contained within its own universalization. So the way that happens is that sort of frays the space of an articulation that would otherwise create corporeal damage. It's like spreading something that is ridding itself of the notion that a synthesis has already occurred, but also it's including the fact that particular hegemonic activity has for it its own representative qualities, and those would be part of the biospheres, the activities that were concerned with how identities were not in flux, but were quite actual and quite, in a sense, activated by this idea of being sort of, whether it were a voluntary action or an involuntary action. So I want to suggest that the notion of something being very voluntary, that one has the volition to pursue something, and identifying themselves in this notion of the I am world. It's a very simple principle of biogenetic activity that has other consequences to it that are introduced by the spaces of representation that have for them varying biochemical, biophysical components that interact with the proposition that I am world. But I would suggest that the activity associated with this principle into the mind is part of something ethereal to consciousness that would perchance offer something that was actual to a subject as a corporeal being that existed within not only a symbolic space but an actual space, and within the coordinates that could be perchance total at some point, upon the horizon, but that they were not totalized upon the horizon would be insisted by those that were positing their consideration that the notion that and the conceptual identification of the self was realizing the principle of I am world.